All right, so thank you for those who have been able to join. The plan for this Zoom session is that I'll go through the assignment instructions with you. We'll have a look at the marking rubric, and I've also got some examples that I can refer to as we're talking about the different sections of the assignment as well. And there are some examples of the first part of the assessment that are already up on LMS. I haven't included a copy of the second part, and the reason for that is that I think that it's too tempting for students to copy that and end up in some trouble, potentially end up in trouble with academic misconduct allegations. But what I will do in this session is show you an actual student example and go through what they've done, the strengths and perhaps some of the weaknesses of that, so that you get a little bit of an idea about what that table should actually look like. All right, so as I say, if you've got any questions, please just feel free to ask them as we're going through. So up on the screen, I've got a copy of the assessment instructions. So this is exactly the same as what is on LMS. Before we get into the actual task, there's a couple of things that I just want to draw your attention to, some things that you really should be just keeping in the back of your mind as you're planning and preparing for this assessment. So there are a couple of premises or assumptions which underpin this particular assessment that you just do need to be aware of. One of the things, the first one is really just being mindful that when we're talking about rural and remote populations, that these are made up of culturally diverse populations, that there is not one culture that actually applies to all rural or remote population groups. Each rural group, each rural community or each remote community is diverse, is culturally diverse. And hopefully you would have seen that in your essays as you were starting to look at some of the characteristics of your identified community, that you'll see that there's, these communities are made up of people, of varying ages, various ethnic backgrounds, religious beliefs, socioeconomic status. There's a whole range of social and cultural factors that come into play when we're talking about rural and remote populations. It's not a homogenous group. The other premise for this particular assessment is that while we have shared attributes, that humans also have significant cultural distinctions, and that is because we are different sexes, we're different genders, we're different ages, we have different socioeconomic backgrounds, we've had different levels of access to opportunities in our life, different experiences, and so all of these factors come into play. And so while there might be attributes that perhaps we share because of some of those factors, there are a whole lot of other factors that actually make us more distinct. So just bear that in mind, that when we're talking about culture, there's not one homogenous culture, or one model that suits everybody. The other reason why we're looking at cultural safety, cultural competence, and the reason for looking at that is that valuing cultural diversity and cultural competence is part of a responsive and equitable healthcare system. It's about recognising that people come into our practices, whether that be in clinical practice or whether that be in community practices, with different cultural values, different cultural beliefs. They are diverse. We have our own cultural values, our own beliefs, our own experiences that come into play. And so we just need to be mindful that there may be some cultural groups who might actually require us to work in a different way. And so that's part of the purpose of why we're getting you to explore this in this particular subject, and to do that within the context of rural and remote communities. And the last point there is that you'll see is, what really matters to the person at the centre of care is how the health professional responds to them in any particular encounter. And so this assessment is not about your cultural safety so much. It's about what are you going to do, or what can you do as a health professional or any sort of professional to ensure that the encounters that you have with your clients, with communities, with patients, whatever term you want to use, is actually an encounter that is culturally safe for them. So this is about the cultural safety of communities. It's not so much about your individual cultural safety, although that certainly is a factor, but it's not the purpose of this particular assessment. So when we're talking about cultural safety, you can see that what we're referring to is an environment that is safe for people. Where there is no assault, no challenge or denial of their identity, of who they are and what they need. It is about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge and experience of learning, living and working together with dignity and truly listening. So one of the things that we will be looking for in this assessment, and particularly when you move into part 2 and starting to think about your cultural safety plan, is how are you going to demonstrate this shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge and experience? Okay, so just keep those things in the back of your mind as you're planning and preparing for this. Some other important things to just remember before you launch off into writing this is that cultural safety is relevant to all people. All groups, all individuals. It's not just those who identify as perhaps Indigenous Australians or refugees or people born overseas. What we often see in this subject is that there's a tendency for students to view these groups as relatively homogenous groups. So what we see are assumptions being made about population groups like Indigenous Australia, where the assumption is that they're all the same, that they share the same cultural values, that they share the same beliefs, that they share the same understanding and experiences, which is not the case. And hopefully you would have seen in your essays through some of the research and the reading that you were doing, that you would have seen that these subpopulation groups are diverse, that they're not all the same. And so I just want you to bear that in mind. And the other thing is that, cultural safety is applicable and relative. It's relevant to everybody. It doesn't matter what age you are, what sex or gender you are. It doesn't matter what socioeconomic status background you have, your education level, your ethnicity or race, or even your religion. Cultural safety applies to equally to, white middle class Anglo-Saxons as it does to refugees, people born overseas, migrants, and Indigenous Australians. Okay. So just be mindful that when we're talking about cultural safety, we're not talking about homogenous groups here. The other thing is that there can be both similarities and differences within and across these cultural groups. So it's about being sensitive to the diversity of these groups and ensuring that we're providing quality, safe and equitable care to these particular groups. And so being mindful of not slipping into language that is perhaps stereotyping or stigmatising particular groups of people. In the past, we've seen a lot of students in this subject making assumptions and using language that does perpetuate stereotypes, both positive and negatively, which leads to victim blaming. Fortunately, this year in the essays, we didn't really see a lot of that, which was really pleasing to see. And I'm hoping that that transfers into this particular assessment. But just be mindful that you're not using the language that is going to perpetuate those stereotypes or that stigmatization of particular groups. And so one of the examples that we've got there is, if you're going to talk about, drinking in rural men, you'd need to use some evidence around that. So provide the statistics for drinking in rural areas rather than just saying that men in rural areas drink a lot. Okay, so just be mindful of the language that you're using. And as I said, this assessment is really about the experience of patients or clients or communities, and it's about the impact that you as the professional might have in terms of creating culturally safe services and practices for those populations. Okay, as I say, it's not so much about your individual cultural safety. Just a few things to note in terms of the submission requirements. So please ensure that you have your name, your student number, course and year level in the footer. The assignment should be submitted via LMS as either a Word or a PDF. Word is preferable, but we will accept both. That's not a problem. The word count for this assessment is the equivalent to 1,000 words, plus or minus 10%. So we have said it's an equivalent. We are not hard and fast about the 1,000 words plus or minus 10%. And the reason for that is that we've had to provide an equivalence to writing an essay, but this is not a traditional essay. But what we recognised is that there's quite a lot of work that needs to go into the reflection and the planning and the preparation for the writing of this assessment. So the word count here is a little bit more fluid. So I don't have any problem with students who might need to go to, say, 1,500 or even 1,800 words in this assessment. From my perspective, I would much rather that you were writing 1,500 or 1,800 words and doing a really good job at being able to meet the criteria and demonstrate what you would be doing in terms of learning objectives and culturally safe practice, to demonstrate your understanding of these concepts and these principles, rather than trying to squeeze things into sort of 1,000 words. In saying that, I don't want you writing 2,000 or 3,000 words, and the reason for that is because of the weighting of the assessment. I just don't want you to be sort of doubling the word count. So just bear that in mind. But if you need to go over the 10%, that is absolutely fine from our perspective, and the facilitators are all aware of that as well. All right. The other thing is that this is a reflective piece. So we would be expecting you to be writing in first person. So unlike your essay where you were required to write in the third person and remain objective, here it is absolutely okay for you to write in the first person and use words such as I, me, or my, because you will be required to reflect on your culture, your values, your beliefs, your assumptions, and perhaps experiences that you may have had in relation to cultural factors. So you can absolutely use first person throughout this essay. Absolutely fine. All right, so let's get into the actual task and what you're required to do. So we're building on some of the work that you've already been doing in this subject in relation to cultural safety, cultural competence, and also reflection as well. So if you think back to week 5, we introduced you to the concepts of cultural safety and cultural competence, and we also got you to begin that reflection on your culture. And you've had to come back and link some of those concepts to some of the other modules in the subject, like the module that you've just completed around Indigenous health. So this is building on some of that work that you've already previously done in the subject. And it's about getting you to be critical in your reflection, on your own cultural competence, on your culture, your values, your beliefs, your assumptions, the experiences that you have had or perhaps witnessed, and apply these to culturally safe practices for rural health outcomes. And so the other thing to just bear in mind for this particular assessment is that we want you to be mindful that you're, thinking about how does all of this come into play in a rural or remote context, okay? I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So there's 2 parts to this assessment. So the first part is about being able to provide culturally safe practice and being aware of social and cultural factors. The second part is around developing culturally safe practice and using continued reflection to do that. And what you'll be doing in that second part is really thinking about what you can do on a practical day-to-day level to ensure that you're practicing in a way which is culturally safe for rural and remote communities. So 2 parts, and each part has a number of sections that you need to address. So we'll start off by looking at part 1. So part 1 has 3 sections that you need to complete or need to address. When you're structuring your assignment, it's okay to use headings and subheadings, and in fact I would encourage you to use headings that reflect each of these sections. And for a couple of reasons. One is that it helps give you structure to write this. It helps you to identify the sections that you have completed and what you might still need to do. And thirdly, it actually helps us with the marking. So by structuring this with headings that reflect each of these sections, you leave us as examiners with no doubt that you have addressed these sections. Our job is then really looking at to what extent have you addressed this and how does this actually match with the marking rubric. So from our perspective, using some headings to structure this makes our job a hell of a lot easier. We don't have to go searching. We don't have to look for any sort of hidden meanings or hidden content. You're basically just slapping us with the content. Here it is. Okay, so yeah, use some headings. So the first section of part 1 is that you need to identify a cultural factor you may encounter in a rural or remote setting that would be a challenge for you in a professional setting. Okay, so you need to identify a cultural factor that you would find challenging. So in order to do that, you'll need to do some further reflection on your culture. Okay, you'll need to think about, what is something that you would find challenging working particularly in a professional setting and most importantly in a rural or remote setting. Okay, there's some examples there. You don't have to use one of these examples. These are just that, they're just examples. But it might be, for example, that you don't believe in same-sex attraction, but you've got a young man who's attending your clinic who wants to talk about his issues in relation to this. Or you might believe in equal rights for men and women, but you find yourself working in a very conservative or very traditional community where your views are perhaps not shared by that particular community. So you do need to think about, do some reflection and think about, what's a cultural factor that you're likely to encounter and why would you find this particularly challenging? Okay, so what are your beliefs or values that are, that are underpinning this? What experiences have you had that have perhaps, led you to think that this would be a challenge? It may be that you've had been the recipient on the receiving end of an encounter where perhaps you, have felt that your cultural identity has been threatened in some way, where you perhaps have not been treated with the sensitivity or the respect that perhaps you would have expected from a professional. It may be that you have witnessed something that has happened to somebody else, whether it be a family member or if you've been on placement, you may have witnessed an encounter where perhaps a professional may have acted in a way that was not culturally sensitive to a particular patient or client or group of people. But what we want you to do is you need to personalize this. So you need to think about, the most important thing here is, why would you find this challenging? Okay. The second section in this part is, given that valuing cultural diversity and cultural competence is part of a responsive and equitable healthcare system, how would you approach the above situation? So you've identified a cultural factor that you'd find challenging. You're able to talk about, you know, why this might be experienced in a particular setting, why you personally would find it challenging. Now you need to tell us, how would you approach this? Okay, so you need to think about how you're going to demonstrate. If we go back to that explanation earlier about what we're talking about in terms of cultural safety, we're talking about shared understanding, shared respect, you know, shared knowledge, shared learning and experiences. How would you demonstrate that in your response to that particular situation? Okay, so in this section here, and this doesn't have to be long, what you'd need to do is link that to some of the principles or practices or steps in terms of cultural safety and cultural competence. Okay, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. And then the third section in part 1 is to briefly outline how such a cultural factor impacts on the health of rural populations or a specific rural population. So here you need to link this to the rural context, okay? And so you'll need to bring in some sort of literature and some evidence here, as well as doing a little bit of reflection as well. There's a couple of ways that you can approach this last point, and that is that, you know, you could look at a specific rural population, you know, a rural community. So, for example, you might want to look at how this might play out for the community that you looked at in your essay, okay? Or you can keep this a bit broader and look at how this might impact on the health of rural populations more broadly. So what I'll do is I'll just show you a couple of examples of this first part of the assessment. So these examples are up on LMS already. I've put these up a little while ago. What you'll see as we go through these, and I'm not going to read through these word for word, but I'll just point out different bits that students have done in each of these. But what you'll see is that each one is structured slightly differently. Okay, so this first example uses headings, but it only uses the headings for part 1 and part 2. Which is not a problem, but it just means that as an examiner, we have to work a little bit harder to work out what's section A, what's section B, and what's section C. It's not a big deal, but it does take us a little bit longer just to work out what people are referring to, which sections people are referring to. What I have done with these is you'll see that I've put in some annotations around these. So I've highlighted what students are doing in this example and how that links into different sections, but highlighting both strengths and limitations. So these are not necessarily perfect examples. They are examples that have got good marks, but there's definitely room for some improvement in each of these. As there is with any written piece that a student does, there's always things that students could do a little bit differently to improve on it. And so we've pointed out some of these in these examples. So you'll see in this first one here that the student has clearly identified the cultural factor that they would find challenging. So in this particular example, they're talking about language barriers, okay? And when you move into the next paragraph where they start to explain why this would be a challenge, they're linking this to Indigenous populations and English not necessarily being the main language of some Indigenous population groups. You can see here that they are explaining why this would be a challenge based on their own culture and their background. Okay, so they've personalised this. So this is demonstrating to us that they've done some reflection here. Okay, and when we look at the marking guide, you'll see that there are marks attached specifically to the reflective style of the assessment as well. So again, there's some explanation, there's a rationale here for why the cultural factor might be experienced within their discipline. And you can see that it's, it doesn't have to be an elaborate explanation. They've linked it, so this is obviously a health promotion student, that they've linked it to the possibility of the poor uptake of health promotion programs for Aboriginal people. If those programs are being delivered in English and English is not their main language, then that has implications for their health in terms of, primary and secondary prevention, for example. As you move down into this, they explain, further explain why this would be a personal challenge. And you can see in this particular example that they're focusing on Mount Isa. So this would have been the community that they looked at in their essay. So they're taking a more specific focus in relation to the impact that this has on remote communities. Okay, so this is a way of being able to narrow that focus down. They are providing, you can see here, they're providing a rationale for why this would be encountered in a rural or remote setting within their discipline, so some further explanation there. What we have made in terms of a comment here in terms of improvement was that they could have actually provided some population statistics here. So if they're talking about Mount Isa and they're talking about the Indigenous population, then they could have actually supported this with, the ABS data on what proportion of Mount Isa are actually Indigenous people. And that would have just really enhanced this particular section, because we could see that then there's some really strong evidence that says that they are actually likely to encounter this in this community, because there's a significant proportion of the population who fit within this subpopulation group. Okay, so thinking about how you can draw on some evidence to support this link between the cultural factor and the likelihood of witnessing that or experiencing that in a rural community. Here, as we move down, they're talking about and starting to recognise that value of diversity. So they're thinking about the impact that this might have in terms of the health of that particular population group, and thinking about the health implications for rural and remote people. Okay. So that's one example. You can see here in this bit here, again, so they're linking it to, health outcomes in rural communities. This is all based on some evidence, so they're drawing on literature to support that linking. So you do need to be using references throughout this particular piece. And that includes part 2 in your table, and I'll show you some examples of how you would do that. So you've got access to lots of resources in LMS already. Have a look at the reading list through the library, have a look at the references that we provide each week, have a look at the links that we've embedded in the workbook, in the content of the workbooks. So there's lots of resources that you can be drawing on to support that link between the cultural factor that you're looking at and the implications that this might have for rural and remote people's health. Okay. All right, I'll just quickly show you another example. I won't look at part 2 just yet. This example here, so you'll note that in this example, they're using headings to clearly identify sections A, B, and C in part 1. So leaving us as examiners with no doubt that they've addressed each of the required components of this particular assessment. All right, so in this particular example, they're talking about men's and women's business. So they're talking really about gender-specific practices as a cultural factor that they might find challenging. Okay, so you can see they very clearly identify the cultural factor. They've provided examples of this, where they might encounter this in terms of their professional practice. So this is, I think it was a nursing student. They're talking about mixed gender wards, for example, where this might be an issue. And then they start to then personalise this as well. This is why I would find this particularly challenging. In part C, so this is the section where you need to think about how you would respond to that cultural factor. So again, they've personalised this, so using the I, but they're also being reflective and are thinking about, their own culture and their own values, and how that might come into play in terms of responding to this particular situation. They describe the approach, to the situation, working within culturally appropriate boundaries and systems or organisation processes. But this could have been, and it's based on the literature and the evidence, so they've got some references to support this. And so what they're doing by actually using that literature, around cultural safety, around perhaps different practices that they might use, what they're doing is demonstrating to us their shared understanding to this particular approach, that, yes, they've got a role to play in this, but so do others, whether it might be their patients or their clients, but also the settings that they're perhaps working in as well, that there's a responsibility that comes into play there as well. So what we want you to see in this section is you demonstrating how you're going to approach this in a way that demonstrates shared understanding, shared respect, perhaps thinking about how you're going to build things like trust and rapport. Okay. And then the last, so section C, they're linking this to Indigenous communities and the impact that that particular cultural factor has on the health of Indigenous communities. So you can see in this particular example, there's the impact of the cultural factor is clearly articulated, and it's based on quality and relevant literature. Okay, they personalize this, and so by personalizing this, what they're demonstrating to us is, that they have empathy with the individual. Again, what they're demonstrating is that shared understanding and shared respect in how we approach these particular cultural factors that we might find challenging. They link this bit, so this is the bit about culturally safe practice in rural Australia. So what impact does this have more broadly on the health outcomes of rural and remote communities? So again, what you see in this section here, it's supported with references. They're clearly articulating, what cultural safety is, and they've supported that with references. They've given us some examples to support that. What we would like to see you doing is actually, when you're talking about things like cultural safety, is putting this into your own words, so personalising it for yourself. And what that does is further demonstrates that you're being critically reflective, and you're leaving us with no doubt that you actually understand cultural safety and cultural competence by doing that. So I don't want to see you using a whole lot of direct quotes. In fact, I would say you shouldn't be using any, but if you need to, then perhaps one at the most, and that might be a good definition, but then perhaps explaining or expanding on that definition in your own words. Okay. The third example that I have included takes a slightly different structure, and again, it's not wrong, it's just a different structure, although it's probably not one that I would recommend. So this one has gone down the path of trying to be more of a formal essay, which this assessment isn't. So they've got an introduction, which is, you don't need an introduction in this assessment. You also don't need a conclusion. Okay, so this is purely about you just addressing those sections in each part. So no need for an introduction. Having said that, this student did have one, and their introduction did actually include content that is accessible and would have been awarded marks for that. So they certainly didn't lose marks for having an introduction, but what it's meant is that we've had to work just a little bit harder as examiners to pull out that information and to see how they're addressing the marking criteria. Okay. So I won't go through this particular example. You can go through that and have a look at the annotations, the comments that we've provided in relation to this particular one. Does anybody have any questions at this stage? No questions? All right, let's switch over to and look at part 2. So part 2 is about developing culturally safe practice, and that requires continued reflection and attention. And so what you're going to be doing in this part is developing a plan for achieving cultural safety as a health professional in rural Australia. So there's 2 sections in this part. One is that you need to briefly outline your understanding of cultural safety and how this applies to working in rural and remote Australia. So in this particular section, this will be very brief and is a really great idea to use your own words to articulate what cultural safety means to you. So there's a real opportunity here to personalise that understanding, but of course you would be supporting that with some references as you're drawing on other people's ideas to help you inform your understanding. The most important part about this is that second comment in this particular section, and that is how this applies to working in rural and remote Australia. So it's not enough just to say to us, here's what you understand cultural safety to be. What you need to do is to apply that to the rural or remote context. And so what we often see is students forget this particular section, and so they don't do as well in the marking guide in relation to this, because they're not actually demonstrating cultural safety within a rural and remote context. And remember, this is a rural health subject, so you should always be linking this back to rural and remote Australia. Okay, I'll show you some examples of this section in a moment. The second part of the second section in this part is that you need to create and complete a table to outline your plan for continue developing your cultural competency and safety for working in rural and remote areas in Australia. For this particular section, we have, if I scroll down, we have provided you with an example of what that table could look like. So I would suggest that you use this structure. It gives you that structure. You don't have to then think about what do you need to, what headings do you need to use? How do you do this? So follow this particular, this table, the format that we've provided. When you're thinking about the table, what you're doing is developing your own learning objectives that you will then link to the steps for cultural safety and the principles of cultural safety. So you'll need to go back to the week 5 material. So when we're talking about cultural safety steps, we're talking about things like cultural awareness, cultural safety. We're talking about cultural competence. So there's a number of steps that we work through to achieve that cultural competence. So you need to link your learning objectives to those steps. You'll also then need to think about actions. So what we want to see are what are the things that you can do on a really practical day-to-day level to help, create that shared understanding, shared respect, shared meaning, and linking that to principles of cultural safety. So we're talking about the 5 Ps. So we're talking about things like partnerships, we're talking about protection, we're talking about protocols, personal knowledge, etc. Okay. And then once you've thought about the actions that you're going to take to help you to achieve this objective, you need to think about the resources that you might need in order to be able to do this, and where you might go to source those. So this section needs to be linked to part A. So, for example, if you're reflecting on language barriers as a cultural factor that you might find difficult. So, for example, one of the challenges that you might, one of the things you might find challenging is perhaps communicating with people who perhaps don't speak English very well, that perhaps, you Anglo-Saxon, English is your only language, you haven't had a lot of exposure to people who perhaps where English is their second language, or sometimes even English might be, third or fourth language. And so you might want to develop some learning objectives around what you can do to better prepare yourself and better understand what it might be like to be a person where English is not the first language, and how you can actually work in a way which is culturally safe for that particular group. Think about the actions that you might take to address that, and the resources that you're going to need to support you in developing or implementing those particular actions. So I'll show you a student example. As I said, I'm not putting this up on LMS. You can come back to this recording and look at this, but I think that having it up on LMS is a bit too tempting to just copy this. So it won't be made available. So this one here, you can see for this particular student that they are linking this to part 1 in their assignment. I might just zoom out a little bit so you can see those comments there. So this links to part A and the cultural factor that they would find challenging. So this is the example in relation to, for example, men's and women's business. And so their learning objective is to form an understanding of respect for Indigenous culture. So, they perhaps are not comfortable or don't have enough of an understanding or enough cultural awareness of Indigenous cultures and Indigenous language, and the role perhaps of men's and women's business. So they've formed a learning objective around that. They've then linked this to cultural safety steps, and in this case, they've linked it to cultural awareness, so that very first step in achieving cultural safety. And they've explained what that means, and you'll see that they've also provided a reference for that. They've then linked this to the actions that they're going to take. So how can I, as an individual, form a better understanding and respect for Indigenous culture? So one way that I might do that is to actually go and get involved in cultural events or practices happening in rural communities. And so they've linked that to the principle of participate, okay? They've thought about, going and talking to Indigenous staff members. So perhaps going and talking to, an Aboriginal health worker, or going and talking to, local Indigenous elders, or, finding a mentor, for example. So somebody who has first-hand experience and understanding of the local Indigenous culture that they can form partnerships with and get a better understanding and develop that respect to achieve that particular learning outcome. And so you can see that they've linked that to the principle of partnerships. You can see in this final comment that they're thinking about the resources that they need. So in order to get involved in cultural events and cultural practices, they first need to find out, well, what's actually available in this community. And so one way that they can do that is to contact the local Indigenous council, okay, and ask them for what's available and what would be appropriate for them to actually participate in. In terms of the partnership action area, again, they've talked about, contacting that local Indigenous council or a local organisation and organise for an Indigenous mentor to help support them in their development and understanding of that local Indigenous culture. When you're talking about cultural safety steps and principles, these need to be referenced. So these are not your ideas. You're taking these steps and these principles from somewhere else. So this needs to be referenced. As you can see in this example, they have referenced the cultural safety step, but what they haven't done is reference the principles. Okay, so I would recommend that you also provide just a reference for where you've taken this idea from. In terms of this last column, this doesn't need referencing, nor do your learning objectives, but you do need to be quite specific here. So it wouldn't be enough to say, oh, I'll just go and talk to somebody, and find out about, what's available. They've been really specific about identifying that they're going to talk to a local Indigenous council. So what this demonstrates to me as an examiner is that they've done some reflection and really thought about who they could actually go to get this information and help support them in achieving that particular learning objective. Because they've taken a broader approach in Part A in talking about, the impact that this particular cultural factor might have on rural communities and their health more broadly, it's okay to be a little bit more broader here in terms of who you might go to. But if, for example, you were narrowing that focus and you talked about, say, Mount Isa was an example in one of the pieces above, then you would need to do some research, and I would be expecting to see here that you're talking about the resources or the organisations that are available specifically in that community of Mount Isa. Okay, so what you need, so this is where that reflection and that research all comes into play, demonstrating to us that you have really reflected on where you can go and what resources or supports you might need to help you to achieve these particular learning objectives. So your learning objectives do need to link to Part A. So whatever the cultural challenges that you've identified in Part A, then you need to develop some learning objectives that reflect that. How are you going? What can you do in order to, practice in a culturally safe way so that that cultural factor doesn't become a challenge for you, that you're working towards addressing that. And just remembering that, the cultural safety is an ongoing practice. There is always more that we can be doing. There is always, more that we can be learning. It's an ongoing process. So this is not about you, saying that this is my plan and at the end of this, I'm absolutely going to be culturally safe. This is about you just identifying some things that you can actually take away with you into practice and continue to actually be working on as practitioners, regardless of what your discipline is, and regardless of whether you work in health. We have students in this subject, for example, who, are education students who are going to be teachers. I would encourage you to be thinking about learning objectives that apply to your practice as teachers. So in this assessment, if you're not a health student, that's not a problem. Where we say to link this to and to reflect on what this means for you in terms of your practice, reflect on your discipline, whatever that is. You don't have to be a health student to be able to reflect on your practice here. So there are some other examples of learning objectives in this one. So you can see that they've taken a slightly more broader approach in the second objective. So their second one is around being self-aware and to reflect on their own personal and professional practice. So, it's not explicitly linked to the cultural challenge, but it's something that they've identified that they need to continue working on in order to become culturally safe practitioners. So it's okay to have a combination of learning objectives that are explicit to the cultural factor that you'd find challenging, and some that are perhaps a little bit more broader in scope. That's fine too. The other thing in terms of the number of objectives, I would think 3 to 4. I think 1 or 2 is too few. I think anything more than sort of 4 is probably really too many, particularly with the word count. So aim for at least 3, no more than 4. And have 1 or 2 that are directly related to the cultural factors that you would find challenging that you've talked about in part A. We'll just quickly show you that first section. So in part 2, that first section where you have to briefly outline your understanding of cultural safety, you can see in this example here that this is really brief. You know, use your own words, but also use some references to explain what cultural safety means to you. And as I say, most importantly, you want to link that to rural practice. If you're not linking it to specifically into that rural and remote context, then you won't do very well in terms of the marks, because you've kind of missed the point and you haven't followed the instructions. But you can see, very brief, a paragraph is all we're looking for in that section. Okay. All right. Are there any questions about the part 2? I'm just conscious of time. No. Is this helpful? You can unmute if you. Yeah, I've got to. Yep. Good. Okay, great. Let's just quickly look at the marking rubric. So my advice when you're preparing for this assessment is that you need to be looking at this marking rubric. It's not enough just to follow the instructions. There's a little bit more detail contained in the rubric. So when you're going through the instructions, look at the rubric, have them sitting side by side, and have them sitting in front of you when you are writing this. So cultural factors. So this is this assessment is worth 30%. When we mark this out of 100, and then the marks converted to a mark out of 30. But what we've done is showing you which sections have what weightings. So the cultural factors. So that's where you need to identify the cultural factor that you might encounter and that would be challenging for you, is worth 12% of the mark. So in order to get an A for that particular section, you've got to have a cultural factor that's identified, that's relevant to working in a rural or remote setting. It needs to be supported with evidence. So that link to, you know, how this is relevant to that setting needs to have some evidence there. There's a logical and evidence-based rationale that's been provided for why this would be encountered in your discipline practice. And the explanation for why this would be challenging reflects your own culture. So we can see that there's some level of reflection in terms of your values, your experiences, assumptions, etc. So that's how you get an A. The approach to the situation, so that's that second part, the second section in part 1. So where you need to think about how you would approach that above situation. So to get an A, you need to incorporate an approach that recognises diverse and multiple perspectives when working in the described situation, and demonstrate how you would facilitate a shared understanding and shared respect as well. The impact of the factor on rural and remote health is worth 6%. So you can see that you won't need to write as much for that section. It's not worth as much. So it's going to be relatively short in comparison to those first 2 sections. Okay, so this is where you briefly outline how such a cultural factor impacts on the health of rural populations. And so to get an A, you need to be succinct, and you need to clearly articulate the impact of the cultural factor on rural and remote health based on quality academic evidence. So it does need to be supported with some references. And the most important thing there is that it's linked to rural and remote health. Okay. Part 2. So your understanding of cultural safety is worth 15%. Okay, so this is where you outline your understanding of cultural safety and how it applies to working in rural or remote Australia. So to get an A, the concept and purpose of cultural safety has been expressed and is connected to the principles or characteristics of cultural safety. So thinking about, the 5 Ps, for example, so, partnership, protocols, etc. And that cultural safety is applied and incorporated into practice reality of working in rural and remote Australia. So again, you've got to connect this back to that rural remote context. Okay. The table itself is worth 15%. Okay, so this is where you'll complete your table with your learning objectives, and you'll link that to cultural safety steps and principles. So those learning objectives, so to get an A, they need to reflect your own strengths and weaknesses. And so they should be consistent with part 1 and A and B. So for example, if you've identified and reflected on perhaps that, perhaps you would find, language barriers, something that you would struggle with because of a lack of exposure to people, with English as a second, third or fourth language, use those weaknesses or those as opportunities for developing learning objectives. So if there is something that you have reflected on where you think that, I would struggle with this because I lack certain skills or experiences or exposure, turn those into your learning objectives. And by doing that, what you do is you connect part 1 and part 2 really well, and you're much more likely to get that A mark for this particular criteria. The other thing is if you've got some strengths, if you identify that, there are particular values or beliefs or experiences that you've had, you bring to that particular cultural challenge in terms of how you might approach the situation. So that's that part B, the section B in part 1, that could also be turned into a learning objective. So how are you going to maintain or build that particular strength? So again, by doing that, what you're doing is linking parts 1 and 2 of this assessment really well, and you're much more likely to get that A mark in this particular section. But the other thing you also have to do is draw on those cultural safety steps and those principles. And of course, as I said, they need to be referenced, and that your actions and the resources reflect realistic or actual practice examples. Okay. So just, bear that in mind, that when you're thinking about those actions and what resources, it's got to be realistic. Okay, and it's got to be very practical, and it's got to be stuff that you're able to do and have access to within rural and remote communities, or within your discipline as well. Okay, so we want really practical day-to-day actions here. The writing, communication and presentation for this assessment is worth 15%. So obviously we're expecting it will be neatly presented using 1.5 line spacing. That's really important. Remembering that we've got about 150 of these to mark, all online. So having that 1.5 line spacing just makes it a lot easier for us to read your work, and helps reduce the eye strain. And just think about, your margins, and also that, your ideas are being articulated coherently, that you're clear. And while this is not a traditional essay, your ideas still need to be organised. You still need to have good sentence and paragraph structure. You still need to have no spelling or grammatical errors. And that you're, professionally formatting and presenting your work. Okay. The reflective style, so that's worth 15%. So as I've sort of talked about throughout, you should be drawing on and reflecting on yourself throughout this. So thinking about, demonstrating the ability to assess the impact of assumptions, judgments, and or biases that relate to your own culture as well as others. So, for example, you might reflect on, what biases or assumptions you have in relation to other people or other population groups, or other cultural factors, and how that is impacting on your values and principles and practices. So you can think about those assumptions and biases that you're holding in relation to other people. Personalising the challenging aspects of the cultural factor will demonstrate to us that you've done some reflection. I would find this challenging because of this particular reason. I've had this encounter, or I've grown up with this belief, because of my religion or my faith or my family, whatever it might be. Also, the viewpoints and interpretations of cultural safety as it relates to your own practice are insightful, with clear examples as applicable. So we should be seeing that reflection throughout parts 1 and 2, okay? And then finally, the referencing. So you should still reference any source that you use and following APA guidelines. We saw a really great referencing in your essays. The quality of the reference lists and just the style of referencing was really well done. So I'm hoping that carries through into this assessment. So again, while it's not a traditional essay, you still need to have the referencing. So somebody's just asked a question. So somebody said, okay, this is a personal question. I'll respond to this via email if that's okay. That's a personal question. I'll come back to that one. I'll reply to that before we wrap up. All right, so yeah, just making sure that you're using appropriate sources and acknowledging those. And to get an A, we would expect to see no errors or very few, so just some minor errors as well. Are there any other questions before I wrap up? No? Okay, so the other thing I'll just draw your attention to just quickly is that what we've also done is actually put together some hints to help you with this particular assessment. So you'll see towards the end assessment tips. So there's some tips there for preparing and completing both part 1 and 2. So some of these I've already spoken about today. So in part 1, in section A, I've said it might be useful for you to draw on previous experiences of cultural factors or those that you might have witnessed. As I said, it may be something that you've been on the receiving end. It may be something that you have been on the giving end, that perhaps you've had an encounter where you acted in a way that perhaps was culturally insensitive or lacked cultural awareness. And having now done this subject and have a better understanding, you're able to reflect on that, and you could use that, to inform or prompt the cultural factor that you might find challenging that you're going to talk about in this assessment. You may have seen something on placement if you've had placement. If you haven't had an experience, that's okay. You can still do a really good level of reflection in terms of thinking about your own language, behaviours, values, attitudes, assumptions and biases as well. And thinking about that, it may be that experiences that you had may not be in a professional context, but it might be, for example, experiences that you've had growing up, say in a rural or remote area, or having grown up in sort of more metropolitan areas where you've not had exposure to rural population groups and rural culture. So I think there's lots of, when we talk about experiences, we're not necessarily always talking about experiences within the healthcare setting, or necessarily even experiences that you've had in rural or remote communities. But there are still experiences that you might have had that you can draw on and reflect on in helping you to discuss why a particular cultural factor might be challenging for you. So just bear that in mind. In part B, again, you'll need to do some of that reflection on your culture. you need to get to know how you feel about a range of cultural differences. So, you know, you might want to engage in some discussions about challenging topics, do some research on rural culture. Remember at the very start I said that, you know, there is not one homogenous rural culture. And so just bear that in mind, that you might want to look at, well, what are some of the factors that might contribute to rural culture? You might want to talk about, if you're more familiar with a particular rural community, you could think about the culture of that community, but you need to also support that with some references as well. For that particular section, you might want to have a look at the chapter 5 in Bin and Goonj on culture shock. So that's available as an ebook through the library. So that's a really good chapter to help you just to think about how you might actually approach that your particular situation that you're reflecting on. And then for part C, you know, consider the role that rural culture has in the determinants of health. You might want to think about, so in terms of how you're linking this cultural factor to the health outcomes, is linking that through determinants of health. So just bear that in mind as well. For part 2, when you're looking at section A, so as I said, you should be demonstrating your own understanding. You know, so it's not enough just to simply state that rural culture reflects the she'll be right attitude. You know, we want to know what this means to you or how you've experienced this. So if you've grown up in a rural or remote community, there's an opportunity here to do some further reflection and to demonstrate, so using your own examples of rural culture within a rural or remote context. If you haven't, that's fine. There are other ways that you can demonstrate that link to rural and remote context. As I've made a note here that obviously with the word count, you don't have to cover all aspects of cultural safety. You might just want to pick out one or two key ideas or assumptions and talk about those. It's not expected in this section that you talk about everything, okay? And then in the cultural safety plans, as I said, you know, keep that, this needs to be linked to part A. When you're thinking about the actions and the resources, think really practical, really, you know, day-to-day sort of stuff that's actually achievable that you could realistically do as a professional working in a rural or remote community. So there's go back and have a look at, you know, those tips. And I've given you some guidance around some things, some questions that might help you just to start with that reflection. All right, I might leave it there. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to post those to the discussion board. There is a discussion board that has been set up on LMS specifically for this assessment task. I'm looking at that pretty much every day from now up until submission. So please post your questions there. Unless it's of a more personal nature, then you're more than welcome to either contact myself or your facilitator. And before you do post a question to the discussion board, just make sure that you check to see that somebody else hasn't already asked that and that I haven't already answered that question. And I think that's really it. As I say, I'm monitoring that regularly now. Yeah, if you've got any other questions, you're more than welcome to email us directly. I think that's it. If you're needing an extension, please get in touch with me. I can arrange that. You'll need to put that through the formal processes. And you've got up till sort of 3 business days, although I'm happy to accept it right up until the day before. Certainly if there's any extenuating circumstances. All right, last opportunity for questions. Hopefully you found this helpful. No other questions? All right, we'll leave it there. I'll stop recording, and so the person who has emailed me privately, I will get back to you. I will make this recording available hopefully later today, if not certainly first thing tomorrow morning, so you can always come back and view this in the lead up to this assessment. Thanks everyone who jumped on. I hope you've really got something out of this. And I really look forward to reading your cultural safety plans. So thanks, guys.